Elderly black man had just locked up his small accounting office for the night, briefcase in one hand, dignity in the other. But to Officer Dalton, he didn't look like a professional. He looked like a target. No warrant. No backup. Just an aggressive stop, a shove against the hood, and dirty hands pulling $200 from his coat pocket. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't resist. He simply stared. Because what Dalton didn't know was that this man raised something far more dangerous than a complaint. He raised a warrior. A Delta Force ghost trained to end threats before they see him coming. This wasn't just theft. It was a mistake. And now, the storm is coming, in silence. Earl Thompson had been running his own accounting office for nearly 30 years. Every evening, he followed the same routine: shut down the desktop, lock the file cabinets, double-check the lights, and finally pull the heavy glass door closed behind him. It was his little corner of the city, modest and quiet, built on years of careful work and a reputation for integrity. His name was on the window in gold vinyl, chipped at the corners but still shining: Thompson Financial Services. On that particular evening, Earl wore the gray wool suit his late wife had always liked, pressed, buttoned, and perfectly tailored even in the Georgia heat. He carried his black leather briefcase like it held secrets, though it only held client receipts, a sandwich wrapper, and an envelope with exactly $200 in cash, rent money a client had insisted on paying the old-fashioned way. He never minded. There was trust in that gesture. Respect. The kind of quiet understanding built between neighbors over decades. As he stepped off the curb, heading toward the bus stop just a block away, he didn't notice the patrol car across the street at first. It was only when he reached the corner and the crunch of tires shifted behind him that his steps slowed. The squad car pulled up beside him. The engine idled too long. The window rolled down. "You headed somewhere, sir?" The voice wasn't friendly. It was flat. Transactional. Earl turned and offered a polite nod. "Just heading home. Long day." Officer Dalton leaned slightly out the window. White, mid-30s, with mirrored sunglasses that reflected back the sidewalk and nothing else. "Mind if I ask what's in the briefcase?" Earl blinked slowly. "Documents. I'm an accountant." Dalton stepped out of the car before the reply had even landed. "Can I see some ID?" Earl reached for his wallet, calm and deliberate. He had lived through decades of knowing what movements made white officers twitchy. He handed over his license and said nothing. Dalton studied it a little too long, his lips pressing together like the words forming behind them weren't about protocol, they were about power. Then, with no further explanation, he said, "I'm gonna have to check that bag." "There a reason for that, officer?" "You fit the description," Dalton replied. Earl didn't ask what the description was. He'd heard that line enough times to know it rarely meant anything specific. He opened the briefcase himself, turned it toward Dalton to show the contents, and waited. Dalton wasn't satisfied. He asked Earl to turn around. The words came clipped, "Put your hands on the hood." There was a pause. Long enough for a couple walking their dog to slow down, watching from the sidewalk. Long enough for a teenager to raise his phone and start recording. Earl didn't move right away. Not out of defiance, but out of sheer weariness. Still, he complied. Hands on the hood. Jacket pushed open. Dalton's hands patted down the coat. He reached into the inside pocket and pulled out the envelope. $200 in 20s. "What's this?" "Client payment," Earl said softly. "It's logged." Dalton flipped through the bills. "You mind explaining why you're carrying that much cash?" "It's mine," Earl said, the edge in his voice barely audible. Dalton held the money a moment longer, as if weighing his next move. Then, with a shrug, he pocketed it. "We'll keep this for evidence," he muttered, already walking back to his cruiser. "You didn't give me a receipt," Earl said, standing straight now, dusting his coat off. "You'll get paperwork," Dalton called over his shoulder. And then he drove off. No citation. No record. Just $200 lighter and his dignity scattered across the sidewalk like broken glass. The couple with the dog stood frozen. The teenager's phone was still raised. Earl buttoned his coat slowly, picked up his briefcase, and kept walking toward the bus stop. He didn't look back. He didn't ask for help. He didn't even sigh. Because Earl Thompson had seen worse. He'd seen how quiet violence could be, how it didn't always come with bruises or batons. Sometimes, it came with mirrored sunglasses, fake concern, and the theft of something bigger than money. The theft of presence. Of peace. But what Officer Dalton didn't know, what no one in that moment could have guessed, was that Earl had a son. A son who didn't wear suits. A son who didn't ask questions. A son who, somewhere very far from that city sidewalk, had just finished cleaning his weapon and was about to watch a video that would change everything. Langston Thompson had learned long ago to keep his emotions on a leash. In his world, reactions got men killed. He was trained not just to fight but to disappear, to blend in, to become the answer to a question no one wanted to ask twice. In the records, his name barely existed. Missions classified, medals buried, operations erased before they were ever acknowledged. He was the kind of soldier the military didn't parade on national holidays. He was the kind they denied even existed. But one thing had always grounded him. One voice that echoed in his memory louder than any battlefield. His father's. Stern but calm. Honest, always. That voice had raised him through grief and struggle, through the loss of his mother and the weight of growing up black in a world that never gave the benefit of the doubt. Earl Thompson didn't believe in yelling. He believed in showing up. He didn't talk about courage. He lived it. Langston had just finished a 3-day recon mission along the eastern border of a hostile zone. Dust still clung to his boots. His uniform bore the grime of a man who had slept under branches and crawled through mud for intelligence most would never hear about. As he stepped back into the base compound, he barely had time to hydrate before the call came through. Not a phone call. A direct message from command. A name he hadn't seen in months. Earl Thompson. The message wasn't from his father. It was from a fellow operator, a friend who monitored social feeds and fringe news sites for potential threats. What he sent wasn't intel. It was a link. No subject line. No explanation. Just the URL and a brief caption. You need to see this. The clip was short. A cell phone video, shaky and low-res. It showed a man in a gray suit being stopped by a police officer. No aggression from the man. No resistance. Just patience, stillness, and the look of someone who had endured too much to be surprised anymore. The officer's voice was muffled, but clear enough to catch the tone, disrespect disguised as authority. Langston's jaw tightened. He knew that coat. He knew that walk. Even from behind, there was no mistaking it. His father. He watched the officer frisk him. Saw him reach into the coat pocket. Saw him pull out an envelope. Earl always folded bills the same way, and watched as the officer pocketed the cash and walked away. No arrest. No receipt. Just theft. Langston didn't move for a moment. Just stared at the screen, eyes unblinking. It wasn't the money. His father would have given that away 10 times over if it meant keeping peace. It was the humiliation. The violation. The way the officer didn't see a man. Didn't see the years of work, the late nights, the sweat that built that office. All he saw was a profile. A threat. A target. Langston stood. He didn't speak. Didn't curse. His hands didn't shake. He moved like clockwork, pulling up his leave request and sending it through the encrypted channel. His superior officer, Captain Reyes, responded within minutes. Emergency, the reply read. Langston typed just 3 words. It's my father. There was no red tape after that. No questioning. No delay. Because everyone on that base knew one thing. Langston never left the battlefield. If he was asking to go home, something had already broken. He packed fast. Essentials only. The kind of kit not meant for vacation or casual travel. He tucked a drive into a hidden pocket, one that held backdoors into systems most hackers only dreamed of accessing. Not to wage war, but to learn. To follow digital footprints. Because justice, for men like his father, never arrived through the front door. On the transport flight out, Langston stared at nothing. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. Not how to hurt, but how to dismantle. How to expose. How to leave someone naked in the light of their own wrongness. He remembered what his father once told him, back when Langston was just a boy getting into fights at school. You don't have to prove anything to people who already decided who you are. Just know who you are. And let that be enough. Langston had lived by those words. Until now. Now, it wasn't about proving. It was about correcting. About making sure no one ever mistook that quiet man in the gray suit for someone defenseless again. By the time the wheels touched down, Langston was already 5 steps ahead of Officer Dalton. Because what that cop took wasn't just money. He took something sacred. And Langston Thompson was coming home to get it back. Officer Dalton was used to getting away with things. Not the big stuff, not the kind of crimes that made headlines, but the kind that slipped between policy cracks. The kind of wrongs that weren't written down, only felt. He'd been on the force for over a decade, long enough to learn which lines could be crossed without consequence, especially when the people on the other side of them were poor, elderly, or black. He called it street instinct. Others called it harassment. But in his mind, Dalton believed he was just keeping order. After the encounter with Earl Thompson, he didn't file a report. Didn't log the stop. He didn't think twice. It wasn't the first time he'd taken cash off someone and dismissed it as evidence. His precinct was small, his record clean on paper, and the only people who ever complained were the kind who didn't have lawyers. But that week, little things started to go wrong. It started with his department login. On Tuesday morning, his credentials were rejected. Password reset failed. IT said it was a system error, but when they finally restored access, his profile showed a sudden audit request. A routine compliance check, they said. Nothing to worry about. Still, Dalton couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. On Wednesday, his bank card was declined at the gas station. Embarrassing, sure, but easy to explain. Bank glitch, maybe. Except when he checked his account on his phone, it showed temporarily restricted. He called customer service. 20 minutes of hold music later, a woman politely told him the bank had frozen his account due to suspicious activity. Suspicious to who? That night, he logged into his personal email to try and sort things out. The inbox was empty. Not just unread, wiped. Years of messages gone. Even the spam folder was clean. When he called the service provider, they told him the account had been closed by the user. He hadn't closed anything. Thursday morning, he walked out to his patrol car and found a parking ticket on his windshield. Issued by his own department. Wrong jurisdiction, no record of the car being there. Just a citation and a timestamp, 3:17 a.m. The street had been empty at that time. He knew because he lived on it. By Thursday evening, Dalton was on edge. Every call felt like a setup. Every glance from a colleague felt like suspicion. And when he got home that night, things got stranger. His front door was locked. Deadbolt untouched. No broken glass. Nothing out of place. But as he stepped inside, he noticed the difference instantly. The lights weren't how he'd left them. A kitchen chair was slightly pulled out. His keys, normally dropped on the counter, were placed neatly on the living room table. Then he saw it. An envelope. Black. Heavy cardstock. Sitting perfectly centered on the table. There was no name on the front, but it was meant for him. Inside was a single photograph. A still frame, printed from a video, grainy but unmistakable. Dalton's hand, halfway inside the coat of the elderly man. The envelope of cash visible in the frame. His sunglasses reflected the moment back at him. Beneath the photo, a small card bore one sentence. "You touched the wrong man." Dalton dropped the envelope like it had burned him. He scanned the room, nothing stolen, nothing vandalized. Just touched. Rearranged. The subtle way someone skilled could walk through your space without leaving evidence, only discomfort. The kind of discomfort that whispers, "You're not alone. And you're not safe." He called dispatch to report a break-in. No signs of entry, no footage, no explanation. The report was taken, but no one followed up. The next morning, Dalton didn't show up to work. No one knew where he went. His car was gone from the driveway. His locker at the precinct was cleaned out. His badge and weapon were turned in, quietly, anonymously, left on the captain's desk without a note. Some thought he'd taken early retirement. Others thought he cracked under pressure. A few joked that maybe he ran from some ghosts of his past. But the ones who had seen the video, passed quietly among activists, shared in encrypted circles, knew better. This wasn't a resignation. It was a reckoning. Because someone out there had made sure Dalton's name was erased the same way he tried to erase others. Not with violence. Not with noise. But with precision. With silence. With fear. The kind of fear that settles in a man's chest when he realizes he's not the one holding the power anymore. And the hands that are. They don't shake. They don't threaten. They don't miss. Earl Thompson had never sought vengeance. He had lived his entire life by a simple principle: dignity over fury. His generation had marched, voted, waited, endured. He had survived red-lined neighborhoods, underfunded schools, and a justice system that bent differently depending on the shade of your skin. But he had risen anyway, not by stepping over others, but by standing taller each time they tried to fold him. A man of quiet brilliance and unshakable grace, he built his law firm not as a monument to wealth, but as a sanctuary for those the system ignored. He had not told his son about the incident. Not because he feared his reaction, but because he knew Langston's heart. He knew what a warrior did with pain, and he didn't want the legacy he had built to become a weapon. But silence, in this case, had only delayed the storm. In the weeks that followed Dalton's sudden disappearance, murmurs began to ripple through the city. Earl noticed subtle shifts in the behavior of those around him. Police cruisers that once lingered now moved on quickly. City council members, once slow to return calls, reached out unprompted, offering new initiatives, community support, even grant partnerships for local legal aid. His firm received unexpected donations, anonymous and generous, enough to expand their outreach program by tenfold. Something had changed. Not publicly. Not officially. But power had moved. And it was clear who had shifted it. Then came the hearing. A high-ranking officer, swept up in an unrelated corruption probe, testified about long-standing misconduct buried within the department. He named names, dates, patterns. One of them was Dalton. The charges against him were quietly reinstated, and sealed files were suddenly open for review. Victims who had once been dismissed were now being called to submit affidavits. Earl received a formal apology letter, thin and rehearsed, but still rare. The community didn't miss the irony. The man who had spent decades helping others fight for their rights had become the catalyst for a reckoning he never asked for. He had been profiled, frisked, robbed, and disrespected. But in the end, he didn't have to shout. He didn't have to retaliate. He simply stood, as he always had. And around him, things began to fall into place, or fall apart, depending on which side of justice one stood. Langston never made headlines. He never appeared at protests or press conferences. But Earl felt his presence in the outcomes. Policies changed. Civilian oversight increased. Officers with past complaints were no longer shielded by red tape. A few were reassigned. Others quietly resigned. And through it all, Langston remained a shadow, making sure the foundation his father had built was never shaken again. For Earl, the moment wasn't about personal vindication. It was about proof. Proof that legacy wasn't just what you left behind, but what stood up for you when you could no longer fight. Proof that the years spent teaching his son how to be a better man had not been wasted. Proof that the quiet strength of a father could shape a force the world would never see coming. He had raised a protector, not just of land or law, but of people. Of honor. Of the sacred truth that black lives are not disposable, not invisible, not silent. And in the unlikeliest way, a traffic stop that was supposed to diminish him had instead reminded the city, and the system, that there were consequences for forgetting. The fear that once silenced victims began to fade. Other stories surfaced. Other officers were held accountable. Internal investigations moved with urgency. Community meetings drew crowds, not skepticism. Earl's office, once modest and underfunded, became a hub of hope. And all without a single press release, without a single televised campaign. Just action. Just quiet resolve. The same way Earl had always operated. The same way Langston had been trained. And so, a father and son stood apart, yet together, one in the light, holding the door open for justice, and the other in the shadows, making sure it stayed open. What Dalton stole that day was never just cash. It was an attempt to steal identity, pride, and safety. But what he could never touch was the thread that bound generations of strength together. The kind that didn't break under pressure, but tightened. The city would move on. Faces would change. Cases would close. But one truth would remain, etched in the memory of every officer who wore a badge after that moment. Some men are protected by laws. Others are protected by legacy. And sometimes, that legacy has a name. Langston Thompson. And that's what happens when power underestimates quiet bloodlines. Officer Dalton thought he was shaking down a helpless old man. What he did was awaken a legacy built on discipline, silence, and absolute precision. He didn't just steal money, he triggered something far greater than he could ever control. In the end, justice didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It moved quietly, swiftly, like a shadow in the system. If this story moved you, share it. Because sometimes the strongest voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones who never needed to raise their voice at all. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real stories that reveal what happens when the world underestimates the wrong people. Until next time, stay aware, stay human.